no magic involved. Okay, this is a video about those horrendously complex looking graphs in your animal transport book. They're not as bad as you think, is the bottom line. So those graphs are about pressure changes and they're really looking at pressure changes in 3 areas of the heart. They're looking at the atria, they're looking at pressure changes in the ventricles, and they're looking at pressure changes in the arteries. Now, you've all drawn graphs with 3 different lines on in your skills homework. That's all this is. It's one graph of pressure against time with 3 lines on it showing 3 different chambers. So what do you need to sort of get a grip on before you can start looking at these? And that's probably the reasons for pressure changes. So pressure will increase if you've got blood entering. So if you put more in, there's going to be more pressure. And the other reason would be contraction of a chamber, which would lower the volume and sort of squeeze on the blood, if you like. So let's put our axes on. So we've got pressure going up the side. Oh, don't worry too much about the units there. I'm just going to put pressure. You might see it written as millimetres of mercury, which is quite an old unit. Or you might see it as kilopascals, which is a nice new unit. And then across the bottom you've got time. And if you think your heart's beating at around about sort of 70 beats a minute, that time is going to be in seconds. Now you don't particularly, I think, need to know the times. So we'll start with atrial systole, because that's where we started all of our graphs. So we're going to look first at the pressure in the atria, and I'm going to do that in this beautiful turquoise colour, which is my favourite. So as atrial systole happens, we've got contraction. That's what systole means, contraction. So the pressure in the atria is going to go up, and then it's going to go down as the atria relax. And then the atria, as they relax, will start filling with blood, and the pressure will slowly go up again in that chamber until you hit another atrial systole, and then it will sort of give a bit of a bounce. That's a bit of a rubbish graph really, but anyway, principle's the same. So this little bump here would be atrial systole. Now the other thing you need to know, of course, if you've got a time graph, is that you may at some point have to calculate a heart rate. In which case you're going to look for a repeating pattern, see how long it takes, start of systole to start of systole, atrial systole. How long does that take? That's 1 beat. How many of them will fit into 60? It's 60 divided by whatever time interval you've got, and that will give you how many times it's beating per minute. So that's the atria. Pressure will go up when it's in systole, it'll rise as the chambers fill with blood, it'll go up again as it goes into systole. Now that's not the most obvious bit of the graph, I don't think. The most obvious bit of the graph is the pressure in the ventricles, so I'm going to do those in red, they're the most obvious bit. And of course the ventricle walls are much thicker than the atrial walls, and so they're going to generate a whole lot more pressure, which is why that looks like a real lovely obvious bit of the graph. So as blood is flowing from the atria to the ventricles in atrial systole. The blood entering the chamber will increase the pressure. As the atria relax, the ventricles are then going to contract, and they're going to do this sort of huge humpy thing, which is why it's the most obvious bit of the graph. And they're going to relax, and then they're going to start filling with blood again. So this big hump here in the graph represents ventricle systole, and the pressure is going to go up. So our other chamber is the arteries, and I'll do those in blue. Now arteries, as we know, have a lovely high pressure at all times, so their graph kind of starts up here, and they're going to accept, as ventricle systole gets going, they're going to be accepting blood from the ventricles, and then the blood's going to be flowing along the arteries. So this is representing everywhere where it's kind of below that red line. That's going to be blood entering the arteries. So that's your basic sort of 3 patterns on your graph. Obviously the graphs in your notes are much more beautiful than my pretty rubbish not to scale graph. Well, we've now got some key points on the graph. So we've got places where these lines overlap, and we can use that to work out which valves are open and which valves are shut. Now an easy way to remember is that you've got a shut, open pattern. So this is a so-so graph. I feel so-so about this graph. So this is a valve closing. Which valve is going to close? Well, it's a crossover between the atrial pressure and the ventricular pressure. So this is the atrioventricular valves. Please don't abbreviate that in an exam. I'm just abbreviating it to AV valves so it will it'll fit on my bit of paper. So that's those shutting. Opening, here we're looking at between the ventricles and the arteries. What's the valve there? It's the semilunar valve. Again, not to be abbreviated. We're still up with the semilunars here between the arteries and ventricles. That's the semilunar valve closing. And finally, we've got, again, we're looking at the difference between the atria and ventricles. So this is the AV valves opening. But of course in an exam you might need to explain why that is happening. So the AV valves here are are shutting because the pressure in the ventricles is increasing and pushing those valves shut. Notice that this is the bit where all the valves are shut. So if they're shut there in the semilunars, they're still shut over here. So this is the bit where all of those valves are shut. Pressure in the ventricles, as the blood squeezed on by the muscle, is going to eventually exceed the artery pressure and open the semilunar valves, and the blood is now going to leave the ventricle and go into the arteries. As the ventricles start to relax, eventually those valves will shut as the blood tries to flow back into the ventricles, and of course valves are to stop backflow, so it fills up the little pockets. This is another point at which all the valves are shut. There's no blood moving anywhere there. As the ventricle pressure drops still further and it goes into total relaxation, those AV valves will open and let the blood flow right the way through from the veins all the way through into the ventricles. So if you're needing to explain that, you will need to be talking about the pressure differences and why those pressure differences are happening in terms of ventricular systole or atrial systole, or in fact diastole. You may need to give time intervals at which valves are open. How long is the semilunar valve open for? Well, it's going to be open for that amount of time. How long are all the valves closed? That one plus that one. How long is the AV valve open for? You might get a repeating pattern to do that one. So I'm hoping that sort of simplified things a bit. I think in your booklet I've kind of split it down and described these three pressure changes against time. Do try and remember the so-so. You can just write that onto your graph if you get one in the exam, and hopefully that will help you remember which valves are open and shut at which times.